Your French fries aren't American. Stop. Think about that for a second. Every time you hit a McDonald's drive-thru, every Wendy's run, every Burger King order, there's a 91% chance those fries came from Canada. Not some of them. 91%. $2.7 billion worth of frozen fries flowing south every single year, and Trump just threatened to blow it all up with tariffs. The Canadians are now making calls to Tokyo, Seoul, and Manila. Your fries are about to get very, very expensive. Here's the number that should terrify every fast food chain in America. 86% of all frozen French fry imports come from one country, Canada. Not a diverse supply chain, not multiple backup sources, one neighbor. And that neighbor just watched Trump threaten them with annexation, slap them with tariff warnings, and treat their prime minister like a joke. So they're doing what any rational business would do. They're finding new customers. Customers who don't weaponize trade. Customers who sign long-term contracts and actually honor them. Customers in Asia who are desperate for Western-style fast food and have the cash to pay premium prices. Let me show you how deep this goes. Canada produced 5.8 million metric tons of potatoes in 2024. Here's the breakdown. 34% in Atlantic Canada, 48% in the Prairie provinces, that's Alberta and Manitoba, and 19% in Central Canada. But here's what matters. 69% of that entire production goes to processing. Frozen fries, chips, processed products. Only 20% goes to fresh tables. The rest is seed potatoes. And 3 companies control almost all of it. McCain Foods, Simplot, and Cavendish Farms. These aren't small operations. Over the last 7 years, they invested hundreds of millions into massive facilities in Alberta and Manitoba. Why? Because American demand was exploding. Quick service restaurants needed more capacity, so Canada built it. Those facilities were built specifically to feed American fast food chains. Long-term contracts, predictable demand, stable trading relationship. That stability is gone. Trump threatened 25% tariffs on frozen, fresh, and seed potatoes. For an industry running on razor-thin margins where transportation, energy, and labor costs are already crushing them, 25% tariffs aren't just expensive, they're existential. But here's the real killer. It's not even the tariff itself. It's the uncertainty. When you don't know if tariffs will be 10%, 25%, or 50% next month, when you can't predict whether Trump will blow up negotiations over a TV ad, when you can't count on stable access to American markets, you make different business decisions, and that's exactly what's happening. According to reporting from April 2025, potato processors told farmers they need fewer potatoes for 2025. Contract negotiations showed volume decreases driven entirely by trade uncertainty. Yes, French fry demand softened a bit recently. Yes, there were surplus potatoes from 2024 harvests. But the tariff chaos is forcing processors to reduce American market exposure at the worst possible time. Because while demand might be soft temporarily, the long-term trend is crystal clear. North American frozen potato consumption is projected to grow 1.5% annually through 2035, hitting 3.8 million tons. The U.S. alone consumed 2.8 million tons in 2024. That's 88% of total North American consumption. The demand isn't going anywhere. But the supply to meet it, that's being reconsidered. So where are Canadian processors redirecting that supply? Asia. Japan is already the second largest market for Canadian frozen potatoes after the U.S. South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, all growing fast. As middle-class populations explode across Asia, demand for Western-style fast food skyrockets. That means demand for frozen French fries that meet quick-service restaurant standards. And Canadian processors already have those relationships. They already understand Asian quality requirements. What they needed was a reason to prioritize Asian sales over American contracts. Trump gave them that reason. Every threat, every tariff announcement, every moment of chaos makes Canadian processors pick up the phone to Tokyo or Seoul and say, "Let's talk about increasing volumes." The shift doesn't need to be dramatic to hurt. Even a 5% to 10% reduction in Canadian exports to the U.S. creates massive supply tightness for American fast food chains. Why? Because domestic U.S. production can't scale up fast enough. The U.S. produced 2.2 million tons of frozen potatoes in 2024. Canada produced 1.8 million tons. But here's the difference. Canada exported 1.4 million tons, while the U.S. only exported 935,000 tons. The U.S. is increasingly a net importer. For 5 straight years, import volumes have grown while exports have fallen. And that import dependence is almost entirely on Canada. 86% of U.S. frozen French fry imports come from Canada. The EU provides 13%. There are no other significant suppliers. None. So when Canadian supply shifts even slightly toward Asian markets, American fast food chains face a problem with zero easy solutions. Let's talk about what this means for the chains you eat at. McDonald's serves 69 million customers globally every day. A huge portion order fries, arguably the most iconic menu item they have. Industry estimates suggest McDonald's U.S. locations alone serve millions of pounds of fries daily. Wendy's, Burger King, Five Guys, Shake Shack, Arby's, Culver's, Freddy's, every major chain built customer expectations around reliable access to high-quality frozen fries. Now imagine Canadian supply drops just 10% because processors are sending more to Asia. Where do American chains source that missing 10%? Domestic production is already running near capacity. Building new processing facilities takes years and hundreds of millions in investment. European imports are possible but insanely expensive. Shipping frozen products across the Atlantic costs way more than trucking them from Alberta to Montana. The likely outcome is simple and painful. Supply gets tighter, prices increase, and fast food chains either absorb higher costs or pass them to consumers through menu price increases. In markets where customers are already price sensitive from inflation, higher prices mean lost sales and reduced traffic. Or worse, supply constraints force menu limitations. Imagine McDonald's limiting fries to small sizes only during peak hours. Imagine Burger King implementing portion controls because supply can't meet projected demand. These scenarios sound insane until you realize 91% of your frozen potato imports come from a single source that Trump is actively destabilizing. But there's a crisis within the crisis that's even more devastating long-term: seed potatoes. Canada exported $50 million in seed potatoes in 2023-24. 96%, $48 million, went to the U.S. Seed potatoes aren't optional. You cannot plant commercial potato crops without certified seed stock that's disease-free, genetically suitable for specific regions, and optimized for processing requirements. Canadian seed producers, especially in Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, Alberta, Manitoba, and Quebec, supply the majority of seed potatoes that U.S. farmers depend on. If tariffs disrupt seed potato trade, it doesn't just affect imports of finished frozen products. It threatens U.S. domestic potato production itself. Farmers can't plant crops without seed. Reduced planting means reduced harvests. Reduced harvests mean less supply for American processors who are already facing Canadian import constraints. This is the nightmare scenario. Tariffs hit Canadian frozen potato imports immediately, reducing supply to fast food chains. Simultaneously, tariffs disrupt seed potato imports, reducing U.S. domestic production for future crop years. The entire supply chain gets hammered from both ends, and seed potato trade is particularly sensitive to timing. Planting windows are narrow based on climate and growing season. If seed shipments get delayed by tariff disputes, farmers miss planting windows entirely. That means zero production for that year. Canadian seed producers understand this vulnerability. If American markets become unstable, they can explore partnerships with Mexico, South American nations, and emerging Asian markets. The relationships that made U.S. potato farming viable for generations could be redirected because Trump couldn't maintain a stable trading relationship. Now, full transparency. Claims about dramatic immediate cuts to Canadian potato exports have been debunked. In August 2025, fact-checkers confirmed that while exports to the U.S. did decline between Q1 and Q2 of 2025, those fluctuations aren't unprecedented. January to March 2025, Canada exported 512,621 tons to the U.S. April to June, that dropped to 427,467 tons, a decline of 85,000 tons or roughly 17%. Agriculture Canada explained that fluctuations happen for various reasons, and more time is needed to understand the true tariff impact. They also noted that available data doesn't show an overall increase in shipments to Asian markets yet. So the dramatic pivot hasn't happened. Yet. But, and this is absolutely critical, the conditions for that pivot are being created right now by Trump's policies. Canadian processors are having diversification conversations. They're reducing contract volumes for 2025. They're exploring Asian partnerships. The fact that the full pivot hasn't occurred doesn't mean it won't. It means we're watching the early stages of a supply chain restructuring that will accelerate every single time Trump threatens new tariffs. Here's what keeps procurement executives at major fast food chains awake at night. This isn't a temporary disruption they can wait out. This is the beginning of a structural shift in how Canadian potato processors think about their business. For decades, they could assume American markets were stable, predictable, and growing. They invested hundreds of millions in capacity specifically to serve U.S. quick-service restaurants. Those investments made sense because the trading relationship felt reliable. Trump destroyed that reliability. Now Canadian processors are asking, do we want 70%, 80%, 90% of our business dependent on American markets that could face arbitrary tariffs at any moment based on a president's social media impulses? The rational answer is no. Diversify. Build relationships with Japanese buyers. Expand partnerships in South Korea. Explore Southeast Asia. Reduce American market exposure to a level where Trump's chaos can't threaten business survival. And once that diversification happens, once Canadian processors sign multi-year contracts with Asian buyers, once they invest in logistics infrastructure to serve Pacific markets efficiently, those changes persist long after Trump leaves office. Business relationships and supply chains are sticky. They don't reverse just because political winds shift. American fast food chains are beginning to understand this reality, and it terrifies them. They built their entire business model, their menus, their pricing, their customer expectations, on the assumption of reliable access to Canadian frozen potato supply. That assumption is now in question, and this isn't isolated. It's part of a broader pattern where Trump's chaotic trade policies are forcing Canadian industries to reduce dependence on American markets. Aluminum, Canadian producers redirecting to European buyers, critical minerals for batteries, Canadian mining companies building Asian partnerships, agricultural products, Canadian farmers finding new customers for crops that used to go to the U.S. Potatoes are just the latest example. But they're particularly vivid because they affect something so visible and ubiquitous: fast food. When McDonald's potentially faces French fry supply constraints, when Wendy's has to pay premium prices, when Burger King considers menu adjustments due to supply uncertainty, Americans notice. And they should. Because this is what happens when political leaders treat trade relationships as weapons rather than partnerships. When you threaten allies with tariffs to score political points. When you create chaos that makes long-term business planning impossible. When you treat sovereign nations with contempt, those nations respond by building alternatives. Canada is building alternatives right now, and American fast food chains are about to discover that the fries they took for granted aren't guaranteed anymore. Canada still produces 5.8 million metric tons of potatoes annually. McCain Foods, Simplot, and Cavendish Farms still operate massive processing facilities in Alberta and Manitoba. The frozen French fries that Americans eat every day are still being made. They're just increasingly being shipped to Tokyo and Seoul instead of McDonald's in Ohio and Burger King in Texas. The supply exists. American fast food chains just aren't the guaranteed customer anymore. And they can thank Donald Trump for turning the most reliable potato supply relationship in North America into something processors now view as a risk to be managed rather than a partnership to be maintained.